The thermometer on the sixth floor read 77 degrees, while ice formed on the inside walls of every other cabin in the valley. What Elias Brennan discovered about heat that winter morning in 1839 would keep families alive across the frontier for the next 3 decades. But it started with a tragedy that nearly destroyed him. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of wilderness ingenuity will leave you speechless. Elias Brennan woke to silence on the morning of January 14, 1839. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to coals during the night, but that was normal. What was not normal was the absolute stillness from the other side of the cabin where his wife Margaret slept. He called her name softly, then louder when she did not respond. The blankets covering her were stiff with frost. He crossed the dirt floor in 3 strides, already knowing what he would find. Margaret's face was pale, her lips blue, her body cold despite the heavy furs piled over her. Elias pressed his hand to her neck, searching for warmth or pulse. There was nothing. She had died sometime in the hours before dawn, frozen in her own bed while he slept 10 feet away. Separated only by the cabin's single room, the fire had not gone out. Elias could see the orange glow of coals in the hearth. He had banked it properly before sleep, just as he did every night. The cabin door was secured, the window shutters were closed and latched. By every measure, they had done everything right to survive the Montana winter. But Margaret was dead anyway. Elias sat beside her body as gray dawn light filtered through gaps in the log walls. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply sat and tried to understand how a woman could freeze to death 15 feet from an active fire inside a cabin that was supposed to protect her. The mathematics of it made no sense. Wood had burned. Heat had been produced. Yet somehow that heat had failed to keep his wife alive. The cabin was standard construction for the territory. Logs notched at corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single door, 2 small windows, and a sloped roof covered with split shakes and sod. Elias had built it himself 3 years earlier when they had first claimed this land. It had seemed adequate then. It had kept them alive through 2 previous winters. But those winters had been milder. This winter, the 3rd since they had arrived, was different. The cold had settled over the valley in late November and never left. Temperatures dropped to depths Elias had never experienced, even in his childhood in Pennsylvania. At night, the cold became something alive, something that crept through every gap and crack, turning breath to ice crystals and making even the warmest furs seem inadequate. Other homesteaders had complained about the brutal conditions, but everyone assumed this was simply part of frontier life. You endured, you survived, or you did not. Elias stood and looked around the cabin with new eyes. The walls he had built, the roof he had constructed, the hearth he had laid stone by stone, all of it had failed. The structure itself had killed Margaret as surely as if he had left her outside in the snow. Elias wrapped Margaret's body in their best blanket and carried her outside. The ground was frozen solid, impossible to dig. He would have to wait for a thaw to bury her properly, but leaving her body inside the cabin was not an option. He placed her in the small shed behind the cabin where they stored tools and supplies. The cold would preserve her until spring. The nearest neighbors were the Reichert family, 3 miles east. Elias saddled his horse and rode through snow that reached the animal's chest in places. The journey took 2 hours. When he arrived at Otto Reichert's homestead, the German farmer was splitting wood outside his own cabin. Elias told him what had happened. Otto expressed sympathy, said he would spread word to the other families in the valley, and offered to help with the burial when the ground thawed. Elias rode home alone. Over the next 2 days, 3 other homesteaders made the difficult journey through the snow to offer condolences. Lars Halverson brought smoked venison. Thomas Merrick brought a jug of whiskey. Daniel Croft, the only one Elias considered a true friend, stayed for several hours and helped Elias reinforce the cabin's chinking against the cold. None of them suggested the cabin itself was at fault. Winter was hard. People died. That was the reality of frontier life. The informal funeral happened on a gray afternoon 6 days after Margaret's death. Elias had found a spot on a hillside where the wind had scoured away most of the snow, exposing a thin layer of soil over bedrock. He spent 2 days breaking through the frozen earth with a pickaxe, creating a shallow grave barely 3 feet deep. Otto Reichert and Daniel Croft came to help lower Margaret's body into the ground. Lars Halverson arrived with his wife Anna, who said a prayer in Norwegian that Elias did not understand but appreciated nonetheless. They covered the grave with stones to keep animals away and stood in the bitter wind for a few moments of silence. Then everyone returned to their own cabins because staying outside too long in these temperatures was dangerous. Elias stood alone at the grave after they left, looking down at the pile of stones that marked where his wife lay. He made no dramatic vows. He did not curse God or fate. But something crystallized in his mind during those moments on the frozen hillside. Margaret had not died because winter was harsh. She had died because the shelter he had built was inadequate. Other homesteaders accepted this as inevitable, but Elias could not. He was a carpenter. He understood wood and construction. If a structure failed to protect the people inside it, that was not fate. That was poor engineering. He walked back to his cabin as snow began falling again. By the time he reached his door, he had already begun thinking about heat, about where it went, about why it failed to stay where it was needed most. Spring arrived slowly in 1839. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. Elias resumed the basic work of survival: hunting, maintaining his trap lines, repairing winter damage to his cabin and shed. But something had changed in how he approached these tasks. He had become obsessed with understanding heat. Every morning, when he built his fire, Elias watched the smoke. He noticed how it rose straight up from the flames, gathering against the cabin's roof before finding its way through gaps in the construction and disappearing into the cold air outside. He began to see his cabin not as a solid structure, but as a collection of holes, barely held together by logs. Smoke revealed every flaw. Where smoke went, heat followed. He started making observations with the methodical care of a scientist, though he had no formal education beyond basic literacy. He noticed that heat concentrated near the ceiling while the floor remained cold. He observed that the area directly in front of the fire was warm, but 3 feet to either side the temperature dropped noticeably. He realized that most of the heat his fire produced was escaping through the roof within minutes of being generated. Other homesteaders burned wood to create warmth. Elias began to understand that the real challenge was not creating heat, but capturing it, holding it, preventing its escape. Fire was easy. Keeping the benefits of fire inside a structure was the difficult part. In early April, Elias rode to the small settlement of Prospect, 40 miles south, where a general store served the scattered homesteading community. He purchased items that seemed strange for a trapper: a notebook and pencil, a small hand mirror, and 3 candles. The store owner, a man named Webb, asked what he planned to do with such supplies. Elias said he was conducting experiments. Webb nodded politely, but clearly thought grief had affected Elias's mind. Back at his cabin, Elias began his research. He lit candles at different heights and watched how the flames behaved. Candles placed on the floor burned steadily. Candles placed on a shelf 4 feet high flickered constantly from rising heat currents. Candles hung from the ceiling rafters burned in an environment so warm that the wax melted faster than at lower elevations. He used the mirror to reflect candlelight and study the space above his head that he normally could not see clearly. The area near the roof was its own world, significantly warmer than the rest of the cabin. Heat was pooling there, trapped briefly before escaping through the countless gaps in his construction. Elias filled his notebook with observations and rough sketches. He drew diagrams of heat movement. trying to visualize what he could not directly see. He wrote down temperatures at different heights, estimated by how long he could hold his hand comfortably in various positions. May brought warmer weather and the return of birds to the valley. Elias was checking his small barn one evening when he noticed a cluster of swallows roosting in the rafters near the roof peak. The barn was not heated, but the birds had chosen the highest possible position to spend the night. He climbed the ladder to examine their nesting site more closely and felt the temperature difference immediately. The air near the roof was noticeably warmer than at ground level, even without any fire or heat source. The observation struck him with unexpected force. Birds instinctively sought height because height meant warmth. They did not roost on the ground. They did not build nests at mid-level. They went as high as possible because that was where rising heat accumulated. It was not simply that heat rose, it was that heat concentrated at the highest available point in any enclosed space. Elias stood on the ladder for a long time thinking. Every cabin he had ever seen was built as a single story. Homesteaders built outward when they needed more space, adding rooms horizontally. The idea was so universal that no one questioned it. But what if that approach was fundamentally wrong for survival in extreme cold? He climbed down from the barn and walked back to his cabin. He looked at it with entirely new perspective. The structure was designed to spread heat across a horizontal plane, which meant the heat was constantly fighting to escape in all directions. The warmest air rose to the ceiling and immediately sought gaps to flow through. What if, instead of fighting that natural upward movement, a structure was designed to harness it? Over the next 3 weeks, Elias developed an idea that seemed absurd even to him. Instead of building a cabin that was wide and low, what if he built one that was narrow and tall, multiple levels stacked vertically, with the living space at the top where heat naturally wanted to go? The lower levels would serve as buffer zones, storage areas, and the foundation for capturing and channeling heat upward. A central chimney running through all levels would act as a thermal spine, radiating warmth that would rise floor by floor until it concentrated at the highest point. He began sketching designs in his notebook. A 6-level tower with each floor smaller than the one below it, creating a stepped pyramid shape that would be structurally sound. The ground floor would house the main fireplace. Each subsequent floor would have ventilation openings to allow heat to rise. The top floor would be the living quarters, heavily insulated, with minimal windows to prevent heat escape. The more Elias worked on the concept, the more sense it made from an engineering perspective. But he also knew how it would look to his neighbors. A 6-story tower rising from the Montana wilderness would seem like madness. Elias spent June refining his plans. He calculated the amount of timber needed for a structure 6 levels high. He estimated the stone required for a foundation that could support such weight. He drew elevation views and floor plans in his notebook, working out details of floor joists, support beams, and the critical central chimney that would run through the entire height of the tower. The mathematics were daunting. A standard cabin required 40 to 50 logs. His tower would need nearly 200 carefully selected trees. The foundation alone would require hauling several tons of stone from the creek bed half a mile away. The central chimney would need to be built with precision he had never attempted, rising true and straight through 6 floors without deviation. But the physics made sense. Elias calculated that if the ground floor maintained a temperature of 40 degrees with a moderate fire, and heat rose at a rate he estimated, from his candle experiments, the top floor should theoretically stay 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the base level. That difference would mean the top floor could remain above freezing even when outside temperatures dropped to depths that had killed Margaret. Daniel Croft visited in late June and found Elias scratching diagrams in the dirt outside his cabin with a stick. The drawings showed a tall, narrow structure with multiple levels. Daniel studied the sketches for several minutes before speaking. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "A better cabin," Elias said. "It is 6 stories tall." "Yes. Why would anyone build 6 stories?" Elias explained his observations about heat rising, about birds roosting high, about the warmth that pooled uselessly at ceiling level in standard cabins. He described how a vertical structure could capture and concentrate heat instead of fighting its natural upward movement. Daniel listened carefully, but his expression remained skeptical. "You are talking about building a tower in the wilderness," Daniel said. "The wind will knock it down. Not if the foundation is solid and the framing is properly braced. The lumber alone will take you all summer to cut." "I know. And you will spend another summer actually building it." "Probably." Daniel looked at his friend with concern. "Elias, people are already talking. They say grief has affected your thinking. If you build this thing, they will say worse." "What will they say?" "That you have lost your mind." Elias used his boot to smooth out the dirt drawings. "Margaret froze to death 15 feet from an active fire. The cabin I built killed her, because I did not understand how heat works. If people want to call me mad for trying to solve that problem, I do not care what they say." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How certain are you this will work?" "Certain enough to spend a year building it. And if it does not work, then I will have a very tall cabin that keeps me no warmer than a short one, and I will deserve whatever mockery comes." Elias looked at the smooth dirt where his drawings had been. "But I think it will work." Daniel left, promising to help if Elias needed assistance, though his tone suggested he thought the entire project was a mistake born from grief rather than reason. Elias began construction in early July 1839. The first task was the foundation, and he approached it with a level of care that went far beyond standard homesteading practice. Most cabins sat directly on the ground or on a few flat stones placed at corners. Elias intended to build something that would support 6 levels of logs, a massive central chimney, and the weight of a Montana winter's worth of snow on the roof. He marked out a square 20 feet on each side using stakes and cord. Then he began digging. The trench he excavated went down 3 feet, well below the frost line. Other homesteaders who passed by and saw him working asked what he was building. When he explained it would be the foundation for a 6-story tower cabin, the responses ranged from confused silence to open laughter. Otto Reichert stopped one afternoon and watched Elias haul rocks from the creek bed in a wheelbarrow he had built specifically for this purpose. "You are digging a foundation for a castle?" Otto asked, his German accent thick with amusement. "For a cabin," Elias said. "A cabin does not need a foundation like this. You are wasting time. A cabin that falls down is a worse waste." Otto shook his head. "My cabin stands fine with no foundation. My father's cabin in Germany stood for 80 years with no foundation. You are doing unnecessary work." Elias continued filling his wheelbarrow with stones. "Your cabin is 1 story. Mine will be 6. 6 stories, Otto laughed. "In the wilderness. You should visit the doctor in Prospect. Perhaps he has medicine for whatever sickness makes a man think he needs a tower." After Otto left, Elias continued his work. He laid stones in the trench, fitting them together carefully, and filling gaps with smaller rocks and gravel. He mixed mortar using clay from the creek bank, sand, and water, creating a primitive cement that would bind the foundation together. The process was slow and physically exhausting. Each stone had to be selected for size and shape, positioned correctly, and secured with mortar. By late July, the foundation was complete. It formed a solid stone square 3 feet deep and rising 6 inches above ground level, perfectly flat and level. Elias had spent 3 weeks on work that most homesteaders would have skipped entirely. But when he stood back and looked at what he had built, he felt confident it would support the weight he intended to place on it. Lars Halverson visited and examined the foundation with a more thoughtful expression than Otto had shown. "This is very solid work," Lars said, "but I do not understand why you build it." "Wait until winter," Elias said. "Then you will understand." The actual tower construction began in August. Elias had spent late July cutting and hauling logs, selecting trees with obsessive care. He wanted straight trunks with minimal taper, each approximately 12 inches in diameter. He stripped the bark from every log using a draw knife, a task that added weeks to his timeline, but ensured the logs would fit together with minimal gaps. The ground floor went up first, built using traditional notched corner construction, but with logs fitted more carefully than standard practice. This level would house the main fireplace and serve as storage. The walls rose 8 feet high, creating a space that felt massive compared to his old cabin. Neighbors who saw the structure assumed this was the entire building. When Elias began framing the second floor, confusion turned to disbelief. "You are building a second story?" Thomas Merrick asked, watching Elias fit floor joists across the top of the first-level walls. "I am building 6 stories," Elias said. "That is not possible." "It is possible. Whether it is practical remains to be seen." Thomas watched as Elias wrestled a heavy beam into position. "Why would you want 6 stories? You are one man. You do not need 6 floors of living space." Elias explained his theory again about heat rising, about concentration of warmth at higher levels. Thomas listened, but clearly remained unconvinced. Heat rises, yes, but it also escapes. A tall building just means more ways for heat to leak out. Not if it is built correctly. The second floor took shape despite the skepticism, then the third. By September, the tower stood 3 stories high, visible from miles away across the valley. It had become a landmark and a joke. Travelers passing through the area would detour to see the madman building a tower in the wilderness. Some offered sincere questions about his methods. Most simply stared and shook their heads. The nickname started in early September. Elias heard it from Daniel Croft, who reported it with obvious discomfort. People were calling the structure Madman's Tower. Some variants were less kind. Elias's Tower of Babel, the Fool's Monument, Brennan's Folly. Elias continued building. The 4th floor rose in late September. The central chimney, which he had been constructing simultaneously with the walls, now extended nearly 40 feet into the air. He had built it with double-thick stone walls and a flue design that would maximize heat radiation while ensuring proper draft. The chimney was a masterpiece of masonry that few people would ever appreciate because they could not see past the apparent madness of the overall structure. Anna Halverson, Lars's wife, brought Elias a basket of bread and preserves in early October. "People are worried about you," she said gently. "They think you are not well." "I am fine," Elias said. "You work alone on this building every day. You barely speak to anyone. You are building something that makes no sense." "It makes sense. People just do not understand the reasons yet." Anna looked up at the 4-story structure looming above them. "And if it does not work? If this does not keep you warmer," Elias met her eyes, "then I will have wasted a year of my life. But Margaret is still dead, and I am still alive, and I cannot build another standard cabin knowing it might kill me the same way." The chimney was the heart of Elias's design, and he knew it had to be perfect. A standard cabin chimney was a crude affair, built from stacked stones with mud mortar, often leaning slightly, frequently smoking back into the cabin when wind conditions were wrong. Elias's chimney needed to be architectural sculpture and functional engineering combined. He built it as a square column rising through the exact center of his tower. The exterior dimensions were 3 feet by 3 feet, with interior flue space of 18 inches square. The walls were therefore 9 inches thick on all sides, composed of carefully selected flat stones fitted together with minimal mortar. Every stone was chosen for its ability to absorb and radiate heat. The chimney rose floor by floor as the tower grew. At each level, Elias left openings in the chimney wall, small vents covered with metal plates he had fashioned from scrap iron. These vents could be opened or closed to control how much heat radiated from the chimney into each floor. The ground floor would need minimal heat since it was primarily storage. The upper floors would need maximum radiation. What made the design revolutionary was how the chimney interacted with the tower's vertical structure. Heat from the ground floor fire would warm the chimney stones. Those stones would radiate heat outward into the first floor, but more importantly, they would radiate heat upward through the stone column itself. The second floor would receive heat from below through floor vents and from the chimney passing through it. The third floor would receive heat from 2 floors below plus chimney radiation. By the time heat reached the 6th floor, it would have been concentrated and multiplied by passing through 5 intermediate levels. Otto Reichert visited in mid-October and examined the chimney with undisguised contempt. "You are building a chimney bigger than most men's entire cabins," he said. "This is waste, waste of stone, waste of effort, waste of time." "The chimney is the most important part," Elias said. "A chimney moves smoke out. That is its job. Yours is 3 times larger than necessary. It does more than move smoke. It stores heat and distributes it." Otto laughed harshly. "Stones do not store heat. Fire creates heat. When fire goes out, heat disappears. Everyone knows this." Elias placed his hand on the chimney stones. They were warm from the small fire he kept burning during construction to test the system. "These stones are warm now. Tonight, 4 hours after I bank the fire, they will still be warm. That is stored." "Heat! Stones cool down. You are inventing problems that do not exist and solutions that do not work." After Otto left, Elias continued his work. He knew the German farmer was wrong, but he also knew that explaining thermal mass to someone who had never thought about heat as anything other than fire was pointless. The tower would prove itself or it would not. Words were irrelevant. By late October, the chimney extended through 5 complete floors. Elias tested the draft by lighting fires and observing smoke flow. The draw was excellent, better than any cabin chimney he had experienced. Smoke rose quickly and cleanly, pulled upward by the natural convection of the tall column. While neighbors focused on the visible absurdity of a 6-story tower, Elias was obsessed with the invisible systems that would make it function. Heat flow could not be seen directly, only inferred from its effects. Building a structure to capture and channel something invisible required thinking in ways that traditional construction never demanded. Floor vents were critical. Between each level, Elias installed a system of openings that would allow heat to rise from lower floors to upper ones. These were not simple holes. Each vent was carefully sized and positioned. Too large and heat would rush upward too quickly, leaving lower floors cold. Too small and heat would be trapped at lower levels, never reaching the top where Elias intended to live. He experimented with different vent sizes, using scrap lumber, building test sections, and observing how heat moved through openings of various dimensions. He discovered that 4-inch diameter holes, spaced 8 feet apart, provided the optimal balance. Heat rose steadily but not so rapidly that it created uncomfortable drafts. Each floor received 4 vents positioned near the corners, away from the central chimney. This created a circulation pattern where heat radiated from the chimney, spread across the floor, and then rose through the corner. Vents to the next level. The pattern would repeat at each floor, progressively concentrating warmth as it moved upward. Elias also installed what he called thermal buffer zones, though he had no formal name for the concept. These were 6-inch air gaps between the outer wall logs and an inner wall he constructed on the 5th and 6th floors. The air trapped in these gaps would act as insulation, slowing heat loss to the outside. The technique added significant time to construction, requiring him to essentially build double walls. But the insulation value would be substantial. Window placement was another invisible calculation. Standard cabins had windows positioned for light and view. Elias positioned windows based on thermal efficiency. The ground floor had relatively large windows on the south side to capture solar heat during the day. Each ascending floor had progressively smaller windows. The 6th floor, where he would live, had only 2 small windows, each barely 12 inches. Square. Less glass meant less heat escape. He also varied wall thickness by floor. The ground floor walls were standard single log thickness. The sixth floor walls were double thickness with the air gap insulation. This meant the top of the tower was essentially an insulated box within a larger structure designed to hold heat the way a well-made container holds water. Daniel Croft visited in early November and watched Elias install metal vent covers. "What are those for?" Daniel asked. "Controlling heat flow between floors." "You truly believe this will work?" "I know it will work. The question is how well." Daniel studied the complex system of vents, gaps, and carefully positioned openings. "No one builds like this. There are no books teaching these methods. How do you know you are not wasting effort on ideas that make no difference?" Elias tapped one of the vent covers, producing a metallic ring. "I know because I have spent 6 months thinking about nothing but how heat moves. Every cabin builder knows fire creates warmth. Almost none of them understand where that warmth goes or how to keep it where it is needed." November brought the first serious cold of the season. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and Elias felt the familiar dread of approaching winter. But this year was different. This year he had a tower that was nearly complete, and he had a plan that he believed would work. The fourth and fifth floors rose quickly now that Elias had refined his construction techniques and developed efficient methods for moving materials upward. He built a pulley system anchored to the chimney, allowing him to haul logs and stones to upper levels without carrying them up ladders. The system saved enormous time and physical effort. Each log could be raised in minutes rather than the exhausting process of manual lifting he had used for the first 3 floors. The physical toll was undeniable. Elias had lost weight despite eating well. His hands were covered in calluses and healing cuts. His shoulders ached constantly from the repetitive work of fitting logs and wrestling them into position. He was 41 years old and felt 60, but he was also closer to completion than seemed possible when he had started. Traveling trappers stopped occasionally to observe the tower's progress. Most were skeptical, but a few asked intelligent questions about the construction methods. One trapper, an older man named Silas, spent an afternoon examining the chimney and vent system. "I have built cabins from Canada to New Mexico," Silas said. "Never seen anything like this. It is either genius or madness, and I cannot tell which." "Ask me in February," Elias said. The 5th floor was the most challenging yet. At this height, wind became a factor. The tower swayed slightly in strong gusts, not dangerously but noticeably. Elias added diagonal bracing between floors, creating a rigid structure that resisted lateral movement. The bracing was invisible from outside but critical for stability. A 6-story building that swayed too much would terrify anyone trying to sleep on the upper floors. Otto Reichert rode past in late November and shouted up at Elias, who was working on the 5th floor framing. "Winter is coming, and you have built a tower with no roof. You will freeze working up there." Elias did not respond. He had learned that engaging with Otto's mockery only encouraged more of it. The German farmer eventually rode away, shaking his head. By the first week of December, the 5th floor was complete. Elias stood at its edge and looked out across the valley. From this height, he could see Otto Reichert's cabin 3 miles distant, smoke rising from its chimney. He could see Lars Halvorsen's homestead to the north and Thomas Merrick's to the west. All of them single-story structures, low and sprawling, built the way cabins had always been built. His tower stood among them like a monument to different thinking. Whether it was a monument to innovation or foolishness would be determined soon. Snow was falling more frequently. Deep cold was perhaps 3 weeks away. Elias needed to complete the 6th floor and move his belongings inside before the full weight of winter arrived. The 6th floor was Elias's sanctuary, and he built it with a care that exceeded even his meticulous work on the lower levels. This would be where he spent the winter, where he would test whether his theories about vertical heat concentration were correct or catastrophically wrong. Everything about this final level was designed for maximum heat retention. The floor itself was double-layered. Elias laid thick planks, then added a 6-inch gap filled with dried moss and grass for insulation, then laid a second floor on top. Walking on this floor felt solid and quiet, completely unlike the creaky single-plank floors of standard cabins. Heat rising from below would have to pass through minimal gaps, and the insulation would prevent it from radiating back downward. The walls received the same obsessive attention. Elias built the outer wall using his best logs, fitted so tightly that almost no chinking was needed. Then he constructed an inner wall 6 inches inside the outer one, creating the air gap he had planned. The gap was not empty. He filled sections with more dried moss, creating layers of insulation that would trap heat like a blanket traps body warmth. The 2 windows were tiny, positioned on the south and east sides to capture morning and midday sun. Each window had triple shutters, an outer shutter of thick planks, a middle layer of canvas treated with pine resin, and an inner shutter that could be opened for light while maintaining the outer barriers. Elias could seal these windows so thoroughly that no drafts would penetrate. The door leading down to the 5th floor was equally engineered. Thick planks reinforced with iron brackets mounted on heavy hinges fitted into the frame with precision that left almost no gap. When closed and barred, the 6th floor would be a sealed environment. Elias built a small sleeping platform in one corner, raised 18 inches off the floor. Beneath it, storage space for food, tools, and supplies. Against the north wall, a work table and chair. Along the east wall, shelves for books, cooking supplies, and the few personal items he had kept from his life with Margaret. The space was only 20 feet square, but it was sufficient. The roof was his final challenge. It had to support heavy snow loads and provide absolute waterproofing. Elias built it with a steep pitch to shed snow, using overlapping layers of split shakes, then birch bark, then a coating of pine tar, then sod. The result was a roof nearly 8 inches thick that would insulate the 6th floor from above, while the 5 floors below insulated it from beneath. On December 18, 1839, Elias hammered the final wooden peg, securing the last roof plank. The tower was complete. 6 stories tall, nearly 60 feet from foundation to roof peak, built by one man over 5 months. He climbed down to ground level and stood back to take in what he had created. The structure looked absurd. There was no denying that. A massive tower rising from the Montana wilderness, dwarfing every other building in the valley. Neighbors had called it folly, and looking at it objectively, Elias could understand why. But he had not built it to look reasonable. He had built it to survive winter. Elias spent the final 2 weeks of December moving his belongings into the tower and conducting preliminary tests of the heating system. He transported everything from his old cabin: furniture, supplies, tools, clothing, Margaret's few possessions that he had kept. Most items went to the lower floors for storage. Only essential living supplies went to the 6th floor. He visited Dr. Samuel Worth in Prospect and explained that he was conducting a scientific experiment regarding heat distribution in vertical structures. The doctor was educated, a graduate of a medical college in Philadelphia, and he understood the value of measurement. Elias asked if he could borrow thermometers. Dr. Worth had 3 mercury thermometers used for tracking fevers. He loaned them to Elias with the understanding they would be returned in spring. Back at the tower, Elias installed 1 thermometer on the ground floor, 1 on the 3rd floor, and 1 on the 6th floor. All were positioned at the same distance from the central chimney and at the same height from their respective floors. This would allow direct comparison of temperatures at different elevations within the same structure. On December 23rd, he lit the first full fire in the ground floor fireplace. He used seasoned pine and oak, building a fire that would burn steadily for hours. Then he climbed to each floor and observed. The ground floor warmed quickly, reaching a comfortable temperature within an hour. The 3rd floor, receiving heat through the floor vents and from the chimney passing through it, warmed more slowly but steadily. The sixth floor, initially cold, began warming after 90 minutes. By the fourth hour, Elias recorded the temperatures. Ground floor 48 degrees, third floor 55 degrees, sixth floor 62 degrees. The gradient was real. Heat was concentrating as it rose. The sixth floor was 14 degrees warmer than the ground floor, with a single moderate fire. Elias felt cautious optimism. The system worked in principle. Whether it would work during true winter cold remained to be seen. Neighbors noticed smoke rising from the tower's chimney, and some came to investigate. Lars Halverson climbed to the third floor and admitted the temperature was noticeably warmer than he expected. Otto Reichert refused to enter, calling the entire structure dangerous. Thomas Merrick examined the construction carefully and asked detailed questions about the vent system, seeming genuinely interested despite his earlier skepticism. Daniel Croft climbed all the way to the sixth floor and found Elias sitting at his table recording temperature observations in his notebook. "It is warm up here," Daniel admitted. 62 degrees with a moderate fire below. What will it be with a large fire during deep cold? That is what I intend to discover. Daniel looked around the compact living space. "You are truly going to live up here all winter?" "I am. Alone 60 feet in the air in a structure no one has ever built before." "Yes." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You are either the bravest man I know or the most foolish. I genuinely cannot determine which." Elias closed his notebook. "Ask me in March." The deep cold arrived on January 2, 1840. The temperature dropped overnight to depths that made the previous winter's cold seem mild. By dawn, ice crystals filled the air and breath froze instantly into clouds of white vapor. Elias woke on the sixth floor and immediately checked his thermometer. 41 degrees. The fire from the previous evening had died to coals hours ago, yet the sixth floor maintained a temperature well above freezing. He descended to the ground floor, feeling the temperature drop with each level. The first floor was cold, perhaps 25 degrees. He rebuilt the fire, using more wood than his test burns, creating flames that roared up the chimney. Then he returned to the sixth floor to wait and observe. The warming happened faster than his earlier tests. Within 2 hours, the sixth floor reached 58 degrees. After 4 hours, it stabilized at 68 degrees. Elias sat at his table in his shirt sleeves, no coat needed, while outside the temperature was below zero. The contrast was stunning. He recorded observations throughout the day. The ground floor fire required feeding every 3 hours to maintain steady heat, but once the thermal mass of the chimney warmed fully, the entire tower became a heat battery. The stones absorbed warmth and radiated it continuously. Even when the fire burned down between feedings, the sixth floor temperature only dropped a few degrees before the next fire cycle brought it back up. On January 5th, Elias conducted his most important test. He built a large fire at sunset, burning enough wood to heat the chimney stones thoroughly. Then he let the fire die completely. He banked the coals but added no new fuel. He wanted to know how long the tower would retain heat without any active fire. He climbed to the sixth floor, closed and barred the door, sealed the window shutters, and prepared for sleep. The thermometer read 73 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 15 below zero. Elias wrapped himself in a single blanket and lay on his sleeping platform, something he had not done since Margaret died. In his old cabin, sleeping required multiple layers of furs and blankets, and even then, he often woke shivering. He slept deeply and woke 8 hours later to gray dawn light filtering through gaps around the shutters. He checked the thermometer immediately. 61 degrees. The sixth floor had lost only 12 degrees over 8 hours with no fire at all. The thermal mass of the chimney and the insulation of the tower had held heat through the coldest part of the night. Elias descended to the ground floor and found the coals still alive, glowing red beneath ash. He added kindling and fresh logs, rebuilding the fire. Within an hour, the sixth floor was back to 70 degrees. The system worked, not theoretically, not hopefully, but actually and measurably. Elias had built a structure that could maintain comfortable living temperatures during Montana winter with less wood than a standard cabin required and with greater reliability. The blizzard arrived on January 11, 1840, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's death. Elias woke to absolute silence, the kind of silence that comes only when heavy snow muffles all sound. He opened one shutter slightly and saw nothing but white. Snow fell so thickly that he could not see the ground from his sixth-floor window. The storm lasted 3 days. Wind howled around the tower, creating sounds Elias had never heard in his old cabin. The structure swayed slightly in the strongest gusts, but the diagonal bracing he had installed held firm. Snow accumulated on the roof, then the balconies, then drifted against the ground floor walls until the lower levels were half buried. Elias maintained his fire routine, descending to the ground floor twice daily to feed fresh logs into the fireplace. The journey down and back up became his only activity during the storm. Otherwise, he stayed on the sixth floor, watching his thermometer, recording temperatures, and marveling at what he had built. The sixth floor never dropped below 65 degrees during the entire storm, even when fierce winds created drafts that would have turned a standard cabin into an icebox. The tower's multiple floors and thick walls prevented significant heat loss. Elias wore normal clothing, not winter furs. He worked at his table without his hands going numb. He slept under a single blanket and woke warm. On the storm's second day, he thought about Margaret. If this tower had existed 1 year earlier, she would still be alive. The thought brought no comfort, only a quiet confirmation that his year of work had solved the problem he had set out to solve. Cabins did not have to be death traps in winter. Proper engineering could overcome even Montana's worst cold. The storm broke on the morning of January 14th. Elias opened his shutters to brilliant sunshine, reflecting off snow that had drifted as high as the second-floor balcony in places. The valley was transformed, buried under several feet of new accumulation. Smoke rose from distant cabin chimneys, thin streams that indicated desperate fires struggling to provide minimal warmth. He was looking out across the white landscape when he saw movement near Otto Reichert's cabin 3 miles east. Even at that distance, Elias could tell something was wrong. The smoke from Otto's chimney was sporadic, starting and stopping. Then it disappeared entirely. Elias dressed in his winter gear and descended the tower. He strapped on snowshoes and began the difficult journey toward Otto's homestead. The snow was waist-deep in places where drifting had occurred. The 3-mile trip took nearly 2 hours. He found Otto's cabin barely visible beneath snow that had drifted against the north wall almost to the roofline. The door was frozen shut. Elias had to dig through packed snow to reach it. When he finally forced it open, cold air poured out. The interior temperature felt barely different from outside. Otto and his wife Emma sat huddled near a dead fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their faces were pale, their movements slow. Elias recognized the early stages of hypothermia immediately. Elias got the Reicherts on their feet and moving. Emma protested weakly that they should stay in their cabin, that the storm might return. Elias ignored her and half-carried Otto toward the door. The German farmer was a large man, but cold had weakened him. He stumbled through the snow like a drunk. The journey back to the tower took 3 hours. Elias broke trail while Otto and Emma followed, stopping frequently to rest. By the time they reached the tower's base, both Reicherts were shaking violently, and Emma was crying from cold and exhaustion. Elias led them inside the ground floor. The contrast with outside air was immediate but not dramatic. The ground floor was cool, perhaps 35 degrees. He guided them to the ladder leading upward and helped them climb. Each floor they ascended brought warmer air. By the 3rd floor, Emma stopped shivering. By the 5th floor, Otto was unwrapping some of his blankets. When Elias opened the door to the 6th floor, heat poured out like water from a basin. He had stoked the fire heavily before leaving, knowing he would be gone for hours. The sixth floor was warm in a way that seemed impossible given the conditions outside. Emma Reichert stepped into the room and stopped. She stood motionless for several seconds, then began crying again, but from relief rather than cold. Otto entered behind her and stared at the thermometer mounted on the wall. He walked over to it, examined it closely, as if suspecting a trick, then read the temperature aloud in disbelief. 77 degrees. Elias closed the door behind them, sealing the warmth inside. "Sit," he said. "Warm yourselves." The Reicherts sat at Elias's table, still wrapped in their blankets, but no longer shaking. Color slowly returned to their faces. Otto kept looking at the thermometer, then at Elias, then back at the thermometer. Emma simply sat with her eyes closed, hands wrapped around a cup of hot water Elias provided. After 22 minutes of silence, Otto spoke. His voice was quiet, all mockery gone. "Our cabin was freezing. We burned all our firewood trying to stay warm. The fire gave heat for 1 hour. Then the cold returned. We burned our chairs. We burned planks from our table. Nothing worked. The cold was stronger than the fire." "Your cabin has gaps," Elias said. "Cold air comes in as fast as the fire heats the air inside. You are trying to heat the entire valley." "And this tower?" Otto gestured around the warm room. "How does it stay warm?" Elias explained the system he had built. The vertical design that captured rising heat. The central chimney that acted as a thermal battery. The multiple floors that created insulation layers. The careful ceiling and double walls on the sixth floor. The vent system that allowed heat to concentrate at the top. Otto listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the German farmer was quiet for a long moment. "I called you mad," Otto finally said. "I told everyone, you were wasting your time building foolishness." "You did. I was wrong." The Reicherts stayed 3 days in Elias's tower while the extreme cold persisted. They slept on the 5th floor, which maintained a steady 60 degrees, while Elias remained on the 6th. During the day, all three stayed on the top floor where warmth was greatest. Otto and Emma recovered their strength, ate from Elias's supplies, and experienced what winter shelter could be when properly engineered. On the second day, someone knocked on the ground floor door. Elias descended and found Lars Halverson and his wife Anna, both shivering despite heavy furs. Their situation was the same as the Reicherts had been. Their cabin could not maintain heat. They had burned everything they could spare and were still freezing. Elias brought them up to the 6th floor. Anna's reaction mirrored Emma's. She stood in the warmth and cried. Lars walked to the thermometer, studied it, then looked at Elias with an expression mixing embarrassment and gratitude. "I thought you were building useless height. I did not understand." "Most people do not think about heat," Elias said. "They think about fire. Fire and heat are not the same thing." Thomas Merrick arrived on the 3rd day, not because his cabin was failing, but because he wanted to see if the tower truly worked as well as rumors suggested. Otto Reichert, recovered and energized, gave him a tour of all 6 floors, explaining the system with the enthusiasm of a convert. By the 4th day, the temperature outside had moderated to more typical winter cold. The Reicherts and Halversons returned to their cabins, but not before Otto asked Elias detailed questions about construction methods. How had he sealed the walls? What mortar had he used? How thick were the floor insulation layers? "You are planning to rebuild your cabin," Elias observed. Otto nodded. "Not 6 stories. I do not need 6 stories, but 2 stories, yes, with a good chimney and vents between bottom floors, and walls fitted tight like yours. It will take time. I have time. I do not have another winter like this one left in me. If I stay in my current cabin through another winter like this, I will die." Over the next week, as word spread about what had happened during the blizzard, other homesteaders made the journey to see Elias's tower. Some came skeptical and left convinced. Others came curious and left planning their own modifications. Daniel Croft climbed to the 6th floor, felt the warmth, and said simply, "You were right. I did not believe you. But you were right." Elias showed visitors the construction details freely. He explained his reasoning and methods. He did not claim ownership of the ideas or suggest people owed him anything for using his techniques. He had built the tower to survive. If others could benefit from what he had learned, that served everyone. The mockery stopped. The tower was no longer Madman's Tower or Brennan's Folly. It was simply the tower, spoken with respect and a touch of awe. Spring arrived in March 1840, melting the snow and revealing a valley transformed not by the season, but by new understanding. Elias emerged from his tower having survived the winter more comfortably than any previous year in Montana. He had burned less wood than in his old cabin, stayed warmer, and proved that vertical construction could solve problems horizontal building could not. The changes started small. Otto Reichert began construction on a 2-story cabin in April. He did not attempt 6 floors, but he applied the principles Elias had demonstrated. A solid foundation, carefully fitted logs, a substantial central chimney designed to radiate heat, floor vents to allow warmth to rise. By late summer, Otto's new cabin stood complete, modest in height compared to Elias's tower, but revolutionary compared to standard homesteading construction. Lars Halverson expanded his existing cabin upward rather than outward. He added a second story with sleeping quarters, installing a chimney that ran through both floors, and a vent system that brought heat from the ground-level fireplace to the upper room. The work took him most of the summer, but when finished, he had doubled his living space and created a warm sleeping area that would protect his family during future winters. Thomas Merrick built entirely new. His structure rose 3 stories, using techniques he had learned from studying Elias's tower and asking detailed questions. Thomas was a skilled carpenter, and his 3-story cabin showed craftsmanship that equaled Elias's work. He added innovations of his own, including a water tank on the 3rd floor that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. The phrase started circulating through the scattered homesteading community that summer. When someone built with unusual care, when walls were fitted tightly and chimneys constructed with thermal efficiency in mind, people said it was built using the high heat method. No one called it the Brennan method or credited Elias by name. The technique simply became known as a better way to build in cold country. Travelers passing through the valley noticed the changing architecture. Where once all cabins had been single-story structures sprawling horizontally, now several buildings rose 2 or 3 stories. The changes were spreading beyond Elias's immediate neighbors. Homesteaders from 20 and 30 miles away heard about the warm cabins and came to investigate. They saw Otto's 2-story design, examined Thomas's 3-story structure, and asked questions. Dr. Worth visited in June and returned Elias's thermometers. "I have heard remarkable stories about your tower," the doctor said. "Men who claim the upper floor stays warm enough to sleep without furs even in deep winter." "The stories are accurate," Elias said. "You have started something. People are changing how they build. Not everyone, but enough that it is noticeable." Elias looked out across the valley where 3 new multi-story cabins were under construction. "I built it to survive. If others benefit, that is good. Margaret died because I did not understand heat. Now others will not die for the same reason." The winter of 1840 to 1841 proved the value of vertical heating beyond any doubt. The cold was severe again, though not quite matching the previous year's extremes. But this time, families in 2-story and 3-story cabins survived comfortably. No one froze. No one burned through their entire wood supply in desperate attempts to create warmth. The high heat method worked. Elias spent that winter on his 6th floor, maintaining his temperature records and refining his understanding of thermal dynamics. He discovered that he could maintain 70-degree temperatures with 30% less wood than his old cabin had required for 40-degree temperatures. The efficiency came from heat retention rather than heat generation. His tower did not create more warmth. It simply refused to let warmth escape. By 1842, the concept had spread throughout the northern Montana Territory. Not everyone built towers. Most settlers added a second story to existing cabins or built modest two-story structures. But the principle was consistent. Height meant warmth. Vertical design captured heat that horizontal design lost. Central chimneys with thermal mass provided steady heating that simple fireplaces could not match. Elias maintained correspondence with Dr. Worth, who documented the spread of vertical heating techniques in his journals. The doctor estimated that by 1845, at least 40 families in the Montana and Wyoming territories were using some variation of the method. By 1850, the number had grown to several hundred. The technique moved west with settlers, north with trappers, and east with travelers who had experienced the warmth and understood the value. Lives were saved, though exact numbers were impossible to calculate. Families who would have suffered hypothermia in standard cabins stayed healthy in two-story structures. Children who might have died from pneumonia caused by constant cold exposure grew up strong in warm upper-floor bedrooms. The high heat method did not eliminate winter danger, but it reduced winter mortality in measurable ways. Elias never promoted his innovation beyond sharing information freely with anyone who asked. He wrote no manuals, he gave no lectures. He simply built something that worked and allowed others to learn from it. The tower stood as its own advertisement and instruction. People could see it, study it, and understand the principles by observation. In 1853, Elias left Montana. The fur trade had collapsed years earlier, and homesteading offered little future for a man approaching 60 with no family. He sold his land and tower to a young couple from Ohio who marveled at the warm 6th floor and promised to maintain the structure. Elias moved to Oregon, bought a small ranch, and lived quietly until his death in 1872. But the towers remained. Some stood for decades, occupied by successive families who appreciated their warmth without knowing the name of the man who had built the first one. Others inspired new construction that carried the principles forward. The phrase "built like a high-heat cabin" became a compliment across the frontier, signifying construction that could withstand Montana winter through engineering rather than luck.